Hello and welcome to Tim's BMW Repairs and Information. Well, this episode is all about things that go bump from under the car. Well, not just bump, but sort of rumbles and all sorts of weird noises that happen, but you can hear from in the cabin. So we're going to go through quite a few different bits and bobs and how to differentiate which one is actually causing the problem. And we'll actually go from torque converter, gearbox mounts, universal joint, centre bearing, constant velocity joint and the differential. They all have their distinct noises when things start to go wrong, and you might hear a funny noise and wonder, well, what is that? Well, this video is going to be here to tell you what it is. And although this video was started by me having problems in the E31, this video is still pertinent to owners of newer cars like the E64. They have the same bits and bobs on as they've had for years. Still got Guibos and constant velocity joints and universal joints and centre bearings and things like that. So if you've got one of the more modern cars, hang around, this video's for you as well. Yes, everything pertinent for more modern cars as well. They have the same system. Anyway, I'll tell you what brought on this video. My videos are all about things that have happened to me rather than just picking things out of the air to talk about. Yeah, I was driving the E31 to work, and I've driven the same cars with drivetrains for 20 or 30 years now, so anything out of the ordinary really makes my ears prick up and start to wonder what's going wrong. Well, I was on my way to work, usual bit of road, and every time I put my foot slightly on the throttle, an awful rumble could be heard throughout the cabin. Yeah, it's really quite noticeable. Here's a bit of video of it happening. So yeah, just a normal morning really, trundling along. Everything sounds fine. I'm so used to all the noises in the car. One a minute ago was the ABS pump pre-charging the system, and you get to know all the noises. I can hear the differential sort of whining away a bit in the background. So yeah, all perfectly normal. And yeah, I was perfectly happy with the car, the way the car drove. It's just the same as normal really. But the problem occurred just a bit further down the road here, so let's get into fifth gear. And there we go, this is where it all happened. So just sort of cruising along a bit. I better pick up the speed a bit. Just put a tiny bit of throttle on. And there it was, a huge rumble through the car. Yeah, it's very, very noticeable. From where I am, I'm not quite sure whether the microphones would pick it up, but certainly from where I'm sitting it's very noticeable. And the more you put the throttle down, the bigger the rumbling got. I've tried it a few more times, like coasting, touch of the throttle. Yeah, it is very noticeable. It really does rumble throughout the car, and you can feel it coming through the body. It doesn't come through the steering wheel so much, but yeah, it's like a roll of thunder it is. Yeah, it vibrates the whole car. So yeah, I was very worried about it, that's for sure. And I worried about it all the time I was in work as well. Yes, and those sort of noise gets you very worried about what it could be, because I don't do any work under the car. I haven't got a lift. I mean, the most I've got is a pair of ramps, so anything like CV joints and centre bearings, that all goes off to Lee Shannon in Bentley to fix it. He gets all the rotten jobs, I'm afraid. Yes, so yeah, it was very worrying, and especially when I thought it might be the differential, because then you start to think, wow, I mean, that limited slip differential in there was always a bit whiny to start with, but if it's gone wrong and I need to swap it back out again, because I've got the original one in the garage, well, first of all, I can't pick it up. It weighs an absolute ton, and I've got to get it up to Lee Shannon and all the rest of it. So I was a bit worried about that all day, and when I got back in the car I experimented again to see if I could reproduce the noise, and this is what's happened. So on my way back from work, you know, I was quite worried about it. I got to this point, which is the first bit of road I can sort of be in fifth gear and test things again, and so I did the same, cruising, slight touch of the throttle, No, that's perfectly normal, absolutely normal. Just a sort of increase of the V8 burble we can hear through the exhaust and well, throughout the rest of the car. Try again. No, absolutely fine, no problems at all. Sounds just like it always has done. So, yeah, on my E38, it's come home from work, come off this junction here, so I've been sort of whizzing along about 70 miles an hour, go onto this bit of road, in drive, it would only happen in drive, and about here, the gearbox drops into 5th gear, there it goes, and then you get a very deep droning noise, and then the revs will start fluctuating. Down, up, down, up. And what that is that the transmission fluid, after being in the gearbox for quite a few years, starts to lose some important properties, and one of them is its viscosity. Now, the transmission pressure is provided by a pump which is on the input shaft of the transmission, and it trundles round at engine speed, not road speed. Now, we have a torque converter lock-up clutch, and what that is there for is to increase MPG by locking the torque converter so there's no losses in it. So you've got the output from the engine is now directly connected to the transmission, and this clutch is locked up in the torque converter. Now, it takes quite a lot of pressure to close the lock-up clutch. And what happens is, as we drop into 5th gear, like I am now, about 1300 RPM, the transmission pump is going too slowly to provide the pressure on the torque converter lock-up clutch. And so what happens is the lock-up clutch locks, and that of course reduces the RPM of the pump and whatever else, and the gearbox. So, yeah, and the engine, of course. So the lock-up clutch locks, the pump speed reduces, and that means there's less pressure, and it can't hold the lock-up clutch closed. And, of course, we get this drop in revs as the lock-up clutch locks, and then the pressure isn't high enough to keep it locked, and so it opens again, and the revs go back up again. And because the revs go up, you get a bit more pressure, and so it locks it again, and so it carries on like this all the time. It will lock it and unlock it, lock it and unlock it, and the distinctive noise is the drone, which is stalling in the torque converter, and this change in revs, and it's only a couple of hundred RPM. You can listen out to it, and if it does that, you can be absolutely sure it's the torque converter. And I've had that on 2 cars. I had it on my E38, and the cure for that was 2 things. First of all, I tried a friction modifier, I forget it, Transfix or something it was called. That helped for about, I don't know, about 1,000 miles or something, and then it got worse. And after that, I tried replacing the fluid filter and putting, tranny fix, that's what it was called. Yeah, it was something like that. Yep, I put 2 squirts of tranny fix in the gearbox, changed the oil and filter, didn't have a problem at all. Now, I should think that the real fix for this is to replace the torque converter, but if you can get another 5 or 10,000 miles out of your gearbox, change your filter and fluid, isn't that onerous really. And yet, on my ownership of that lovely Mora metallic E38, yep, I didn't have any more problems with that torque converter, no more droning, no more strange change in revs. Gearbox mounts, yeah, they can be inspected, of course, from under the car. the exhaust doesn't get in the way. You can just about get in there. Me and my mate Bob did the transmission mounts on my previous E31, and they can cause a thump as you go from drive to reverse, and also they can cause vibration as well, and also you get vibration at idle, unlike prop shaft problems, because of course prop shaft isn't moving when you're stationary. You can get vibrations through the car from both the engine mounts and the gearbox mounts. The gearbox mounts are a lot easier to replace, and all you need is a pair of ramps, a jack to take the weight of the gearbox. Yeah, it doesn't take that long. It's a bit uncomfortable on your back, of course, but yeah, easy enough to do. So yeah, the noises you expect are vibrations at idle, which might make you think that you've got misfire, but in this case you can hear that the engine's firing on all 8 cylinders, but it still feels quite rumbly throughout the car. And they're the mounts generally, engine mounts and gearbox mounts. As I say, gearbox easy to do, engine mounts you need to take the weight of the engine, and that's best done by having either an overhead lift for the engine. It's quite difficult to push it up from underneath, by the way, so don't attempt that. But no, you've got to get the weight of the engine off of the car and lift the engine enough to get to the mounts, and they're not easy to find either. Whereas gearbox mounts, they're pretty straightforward and easy. So it's always a good place to start, and you can inspect them to see if they are damaged in any way. They generally tend to tear in half, and again that's generally due to oil contamination. So yeah, gearbox mounts, not too hard to work on, cause rumbles at idle when the car isn't moving, and it's the only one out of the drivetrain that does. So yeah, that's quite easy to notice. Okay, next one, centre bearing. This one is much more noticeable when you're pulling away from somewhere. Say we got to this position here and stopped. You start the car moving, okay to start with, then it goes thump, 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 and the more you put your foot down, the worse it gets. Yeah, that's a good indication that it's the centre centre bearing. Centre bearing is a reasonably large diameter bearing encased in rubber, which is in a metal frame and then bolted to the underside of the car. And when they start to fail, the actual rubber part starts to deteriorate, quite often due to oil contamination. Got an oil leak on the gearbox or even on the engine, it all blows back. That can destroy the rubber, and then that stops the centre bearing supporting and controlling the actual hold of the prop shaft correctly. And then what happens is, as you accelerate, it goes out of balance, throws itself around, thumps its way around the centre bearing, and causes that huge noise underneath the car. And it's very noticeable, a real heavy thump, as though someone's got a hammer underneath the car and given it a good whack. And the funny thing is, when you reach 20 or 30 miles an hour, the noise goes away completely. And what's happening then is the centre bearing, well, the prop shaft has self-centred. It gets to a certain speed where either it's going to try and destroy its way out of the centre bearing, or it straightens back out again all by itself, and the noise just disappears. So that's centre bearing. When you're pulling away and it goes thump, 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 very noisily, and the noise amplitude increases with where you've got your foot on the throttle, then that's your centre bearing. And there's also a very important bit with the centre bearing, is they have to be preloaded. And if they're not preloaded, then you have problems with the centre bearing and the constant velocity joint. Now the universal joint at the front that's not replaceable, as we've discussed earlier. It's part of the prop shaft and the bearings are staked into position. Now, remanufacturers can fix them, but us DIYers can't. We haven't got the tools to get the bearings in and out, even if we wanted to. And unfortunately, that means a replacement prop shaft. And I say a replacement because you can get replacements from the remanufacturers, and there's quite a few around, both in the States and in the UK and the rest of the world, and their job is just to remanufacture prop shafts. And we're talking about 600 or 700 quid for a prop shaft, but then at least you get all the bits and bobs on it. You get the centre bearing, you get the universal joint, get the constant velocity joint on it as well, and all remanufactured, so it's going to last, well, last the rest of the life of the car, I should think. Or of course you can buy a second-hand one. There's loads of second-hand ones usually available, obviously more for 740s and E38, E39s, E32s. There's a few more around for that than there are E31s, because I mean there's only a few E31s made. But I did check on eBay earlier on, and yes, you can still get prop shafts, second-hand prop shafts on eBay and places like that. So yeah, that's your choice really. If you've got a universal joint failure, then it's remanufactured or second-hand, whichever one you fancy. Now, the distinctive noise of a universal joint failing, and it can be the constant velocity joint as well, is a ting as you put it into reverse and then put it into forward. You'll get this ting noise, and it sounds like someone struck a bell. Very distinctive, goes ding, and it rings. And that's because the universal joint has moved a bit, hit the sort of worn out bearing again, and that vibrates all the way through the prop shaft and makes the dinging noise. And yeah, it is reasonably hard to tell from inside the car. You've got a bit of an idea if it's coming sort of from this area or that area. And even under the car it's a bit difficult, and I have done that where I've got the car up on ramps and you grab hold of the prop shaft and you hear it go ding 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 as you turn the prop shaft. It's difficult to tell if it's coming from the front or the back, because the actual noise is obviously coming from the prop shaft itself and not the CV or the universal joint, but you can just about tell which one it is. And so yeah, if you want to differentiate between constant velocity and universal joints, then yeah, you have to get the car up in the air and move the prop shaft by hand. And that's how it worked out on the 740 which one it was, and it was the constant velocity joint on that one. But you get exactly the same noise on the universal joint, and that's the noise it will start to make. And of course, as time goes on, it'll get worse and worse on a universal joint, and then you get vibrations through the car. It won't self-center. Yeah, and the faster you go, the worse it gets. Unlike a constant velocity joint, which tends to self-center, universal joints don't. No, they just get worse and worse, I'm afraid. And also you notice them on pulling out here, for instance, and then you hear the ting 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 noise of it. Again, quite similar to the constant velocity joint, but if it gets worse and worse quite quickly, then you can be pretty sure it's the universal joint and not the constant velocity joint. CV joints seem to last a bit of time before they cause big problems. And talking of constant velocity joints, they've got their own distinctive noise. And from a standstill up to about 30 again, you put your foot down and they go ting 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 ting, or dang 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 dang. And the frequency of the noise increases with road speed, not engine or gearbox speeds. And yeah, up to about 30 miles an hour, make an awful racket, and then as a general rule it disappears. Now, constant velocity joints can go one of two ways. You can put the preload on the centre bearing and that can fix it. You can also repack it with grease. You can remove it and repack with grease, and that can fix them forever and they'll be perfect. But unfortunately they also can go the other way, which is they just get worse and worse, and you can do what you like to them and they'll disintegrate. And I've had ones which go both ways. On my E38 740 I had one which started making a bit of a tinging noise, and I said to Lee, constant velocity joints seems like a goner, best go for a replacement. He said, well, I'll put the preload on it first, repack it with grease, see how it goes, and yeah, that fixed it. And it was another 5 years of driving the E38 with no problems at all. But on the E31, in fact this car, I had the same tinging noises, and yeah, I thought, well, I better get that up to Lee so I can preload the bearing. But no, it didn't ever get better. It got worse and worse to a point where I had to get the car up to Lee Shannon's. I had to use all the back lanes because it was shaking the car to bits. It really was. It really felt like the constant velocity joint was going to come apart in a million pieces. It was very difficult. So yeah, that one couldn't be saved, and it was a replacement. And fortunately, as I said, constant velocity joint is replaceable, unlike the universal joint, which is staked into place. So there you go, that's the constant velocity joint. So I was thinking, well, what could it be that's sort of intermittent? I mean, it's very difficult when things only happen at certain points. But I thought, well, I'll give it another go. So cruising again, slight touch of the throttle, and it's back. You must be able to hear that. That's booming. Look, the whole car's vibrating now. Yeah, you can feel it through the chassis of the car. I can feel it through my feet. Can't feel it through the steering wheel. Yeah, very strange altogether. Let's give it another go. And there it is. Yeah, and yeah, booming, droning, and a big rumble until you let your foot off the throttle, then it goes back absolutely normal. And again. Yeah, there is a huge rumble. It really is visceral, very noticeable, and very worrying. And then I worked out, well, that's strange. It hasn't done it anywhere else, but it's done it here. Must be the road surface. And of course, this road surface is brand new. Well, it's a month old now, actually, but yeah, that was the first time I'd driven on it since it'd been resurfaced. And so it's actually the surface of the road that's causing the problem. There it goes, there's the big rumble. And of course, as soon as you get off the new surface, everything sounds perfect again. Very strange one, but at least you can rule that out over other problems we can have. Righty-ho, well, I think I've burbled on probably for at least half an hour, I should think. I think we covered most things. Yeah, so I hope that this video helps you work out what part of your prop shaft is going wrong, and even if it is the prop shaft, might be the torque converter, could be the gearbox mounts, could be all sorts of things. But at least in my case, it was just a road surface. So I was very glad to find out that when I got on a different road surface, it was all right again. It's a cold day today. Anyway, in we go. Thanks very much for watching, and thanks for subscribing, and yeah, thanks for watching my videos, of course. And Alvin, thank goodness you're back, mate. Glad to see you again. And yeah, if you like the video, put the thumbs up, subscribe and all the rest of it I meant to say, and I'll see you next time.